Yeah, this is a talk based loosely on a book which was published last year called The Fevered Fight, and it's a medical history of the American Revolution. The American Revolution in America tends to mean the military event that led to their independence. They sometimes call it the American Revolutionary War. In the UK, we tend to call it the American War of Independence, but they're all basically the same conflict. The war was fought between 1775 and 1783, but much of the serious fighting was in the first 6 years, culminating in the demise of the British Yorktown in 1781. This map is really just to make a couple of points, really. It was a war fought over enormous territory, as you can see from, you can see the pointer, it is there, right from Quebec in the wastes of northern Canada, where the British had a garrison. Much of the fighting was in the middle states, but towards the end of the war, the campaigning moved into the American southern states. So enormous challenges for soldiers and doctors in terms of terrain and climate. It was I guess in some ways a slightly paradoxical sort of war. In actually, the British were very successful militarily and won most of the battles, but they eventually lost the war. They sort of ran out of manpower and will. They didn't recruit the number of American loyalists that they expected. And even for a country with the power of Britain, it was difficult to wage a war across the Atlantic. On the American side, it was paradoxical because there was this great cry for freedom, this seismic political and military event where America did become free. But if you look at the senior American officials, people like George Washington, senior soldiers, many of them were slave plantation owners, and they continued to be so in the years after the war. So I'm not going to say too much more about the political or medical history of the war, as this is essentially a medical history. At the outset of the war, the British Army Medical Department was divided into three broad parts. This department had sort of been born in the early years of the 17th century, and it was to remain with this basic structure right up to the time of the Napoleonic Wars and even the Crimean War. So at the top of the hierarchy were the inspectors. These were the men who pulled all the strings. Many of them would be in London, some of them would be in North America. So they were the sort of senior bureaucrats, usually highly qualified. And then there were the medical staff. These were the doctors who manned the hospitals, the general hospitals and the garrisons. So there'd be the physicians, who were the elite of the army medical profession, but in truth fairly useless in war because they couldn't operate and they didn't really understand the diseases they were treating. More useful were the staff surgeons. These were highly capable men who performed the army's operations in the field hospitals and the general hospitals. And because they were so necessary in war, their numbers tended to increase in the course of a campaign. So there'd be relatively few of them in peace. But as the years of conflict unrolled, you'd find more and more staff surgeons accompanying the army. At the bottom of this staff hierarchy were the hospital mates, and these were like the drudges who worked in the general hospitals, what we might call today junior doctors. But they were less qualified, though, than junior doctors, to be fair. Many of them had maybe a country apprenticeship, something quite minimal in the way of training. Sometimes even ordinary private soldiers were raised up from the ranks to be hospital mates. And then finally, in this group of staff, you had people like apothecaries and purveyors who supplied the hospitals with equipment and drugs, which leaves the final group, the most obvious group in a way. These were the surgeons and the surgeons' mates, later to be called assistant surgeons, who accompanied the troops into battle. So these were the men who would man the regimental hospitals, who would give the first aid in battle and perhaps then retreat back to the field hospitals to support the staff surgeons. So that was the British side. At least they had an extant medical department. They had something ready to go. I think what's one of the things that's quite remarkable about the American Revolution is how structures in the American army were built up from nothing very quickly. This shows a view from the Battle of Lexington, which was fought in conjunction with the Battle of Concord in 1775. So these were the very first opening skirmishes of the American. And there was no American medical department because there really was hardly an American army. There were a few militia units, but the Continental Army, the army enlisted by George Washington, that wasn't going to come into to fruition for some time, certainly in a substantial form. And so there were no real army surgeons at Lexington and Concord to treat the American wounded, and they relied largely on local doctors. And surprisingly, what you think was the outset of a global event, at least in retrospect, many of these soldiers were treated by local doctors, and they were actually sent medical bills for the treatment of their wounds. And at the end of the war, there are some interesting petitions from American soldiers at Lexington and Concord trying to get this money back from their local assemblies. From this very basic sort of embryonic medical department, despite controversial leadership, despite, as you'll see, a lot of infighting, the Americans gradually emulated the British, and by the end of the war, by 1781, they had a medical department that was perhaps not quite of the quality of the British, but was quite similar, and certainly a functioning department. So that was a great achievement, I think, on the Americans' part. So I'm going to introduce you to some of the characters who were influential in the medical history of the Revolution. I'm only going to show you one Brit and then 5 Americans, because the Americans are actually, in many ways, more interesting. This man was called Robert Adair. He was British. He went under the rather unprepossessing title of the Inspector of Regimental Infirmaries, but he was the top man. He was what we would call today the Director General. And at the time of the Revolution, he'd already been in post for 30 years. Longevity was no bar to employment during this period. Adair seemed to be a capable man. He was quite charismatic, but like a lot of senior British army bureaucrats, he was obsessed with finance. And if you read his correspondence, which I wouldn't necessarily suggest you do, you would find, lots of correspondence about the price of wine. There were too many hospital mates, even a complaint that the soldiers were raging after vegetables, which seemed pernickety at a time when scurvy was still such a major threat to soldiers and sailors. And I think that sort of tight-fisted approach did put a ceiling on the efficacy of the British medical department of the wars. It would have been better with better funding. So moving on to the Americans, and this was really quite surprising sort of succession of individuals. The first general of the Army Medical Department was this man, Benjamin Church. He was selected individually by George Washington, who was the commander-in-chief of the American Continental Army by this time. Benjamin Church appeared a good selection. He'd fought with the British, as many American doctors and indeed army officers had in the French Indian War, the 7 Years' War. So he had some experience, and he soon set about trying to deal with the recalcitrant American surgeons who were fighting. The regimental surgeons were fighting some endless feud with the hospital surgeons. And he was making things better when some criminal correspondence with the enemy emerged, and he was tried for treason, found guilty, thrown into jail. I think the evidence for this was all a little bit thin, but sadly when he was let out of jail, he then died in a shipwreck in the West Indies, which made way for the second Director General of the war, John Morgan. John Morgan was an elite American physician. Like many of the American elite, he trained in Europe, many of them trained in Edinburgh, some in London. He had some army experience, and he seemed to be a good choice. He certainly had medical capability, but he was also noted to be a very revengeful man, which was certainly to come to pass. So Morgan set about trying to put the medical department to rights, but in truth he had a hopeless task. The expectation upon him was always completely beyond the capacity of his resources. He moaned that army doctors wanted an American General Hospital to open wherever they went. And he sort of got worn out and then burnt out and was sort of pushed out. And part of the reason he was pushed out was because the person who replaced him was his arch nemesis, William Shippen. William Shippen was a more academic man than Morgan. He'd also trained in Europe, more of a scholar than a doer, according to an observer of the time. He wasn't entirely honest. He particularly tended to underestimate the number of soldiers dying under his medical care. Benjamin Rush, who was perhaps the most famous American physician of the 18th century, who fought as a surgeon in the Revolutionary War, and was also Shippen's enemy. He joined in Morgan in his attempts to bring Shippen down. He accused Shippen of burying soldiers alive because, as Rush pointed out, the number of coffins going into the ground outside the general hospitals far exceeded the deaths in Shippen's hospital returns. And this feud escalated to the point that Shippen was accused of Machiavellian conduct. He was accused by Rush of misdemeanors unknown since the birth of mankind, and this sort of correspondence just went on and on. In the end, Shippen was brought to trial himself. He was found innocent of charges such as corruption, fraud, dealing in hospital supplies, and ungentlemanly conduct. But a lot of the mud stuck, and he'd lost the confidence of Congress. So he was also pushed out, much to the joy of Morgan and Rush. So the final Director General was this man, John Cochrane, who was the only really successful and controversial senior medical doctor on the American side. He was appointed directly by George Washington, and he had a good relationship with Washington and a good relationship with military officers, and it's largely due to his efforts in the final years of the war that the American Medical Department to the level that it was. So this is probably the most important man in the history of the American Medical Department, certainly in the late 18th century. This is George Washington. This is a painting of him after the war in 1794 by an artist called William Williams. Washington's quite an interesting character. He had quite a medical life. He was very lucky to survive attacks of smallpox and dysentery in his early life. He was then a slave plantation owner. And it's been hypothesized that the alacrity and the facility with which he looked after soldiers under his care in the American Revolutionary War arose from the fact he had medical responsibility for slaves. You may think those situations are entirely different, but in terms of his paternalistic approach, they perhaps weren't. He was very interested in the Army Medical Department, very connected with the legend. Always ready to point to improvement. He also took a lot of interest in military hygiene, and he took the most important medical decision of the war when he decided to inoculate en masse the American army against smallpox, something that I'll return. With the eye of faith, you can see smallpox scars on his cheek and nose. And of course, this wasn't insignificant because his early attack of smallpox meant that he was immune to smallpox for the duration of the American Revolution. Many American troops, including senior generals, died of smallpox in the course of the war. This is just to remind me that there were other countries involved. The Hessians fought as mercenaries for the British, and there was a German medical department, probably not of great quality, but similar in design to the British. This man is Jean-Francois Coste, who was a senior doctor in the French army. The French came to the Americans' assistance in the last years of the war, and they played a major part in the fall of Yorktown. I'm not going to say too much about the French medical department, but it was similar to the British, but the French approach to treating disease was quite different to the British. The British, as you'll see later, tended to take a very assertive approach, lots of so-called anti-phlogistic treatments, very aggressive, whereas men like Koss tended to be more nihilistic and tended to stand off these invasive therapies. And an epigram at the time suggested that the British killed their patients and the French let theirs die. So moving away from individuals, this is a view of the Battle of Princetown, which was one of Washington's victories in the course of the American Revolutionary War, showing the artillery, the American artillery in action. This was fought in January 1777. I'm going to go on a little bit later and talk about the surgery of the war, but to understand the nature of the battlefield provision or the demands made on the doctors, and indeed to understand the surgeries, you have to understand something of the weaponry that was used. Clearly this was now the era of gunpowder warfare. Most of the troops on both sides, you're probably not going to be able to see this, and it's a pretty unspectacular prop at the best of times, the troops, most of them, were infantry, and they were armed with either muskets, again the majority of them, or rifles, and they fired these things. This is actually a Peninsular War musket ball, but the American one was very, very similar. It's made of soft lead, and the damage this can do, I'm not sure it's much better otherwise, but the damage this could do would depend upon the distance of firing. So if it was 50 yards or less, this could easily kill you, or at least break a bone. If it was, say, medium distance, 150 yards, it started to lose kinetic energy, and then it slowed as it hit a solid object and tended to flatten out, because the lead is actually quite soft, and it would create a sort of deep conical wound. If it was fired at very long range, something like 200 yards, for instance, then it lost so much energy that it might just bounce off, or perhaps cause a minor contusion, or bounce off a uniform strap. These things, of course, were completely different. These fired round shot, or what would be more commonly perhaps known as cannonballs. Artillery injuries tend to be underestimated in the records of wounded from 17th and 18th century battles, simply because they were often fatal immediately, and soldiers who survived them would often need mangled arms and legs amputated. And then there were swords. Simplistically, there were two types of swords. There were the very heavy broadswords, the straight swords used by the heavy cavalry, of which there was a limited amount in the American Revolutionary War, but they would tend to be used in a sort of thrusting manner so that you get penetrating chest injuries. And then the lighter sabres of the light cavalry would be used in a sort of slashing manner, and you'd often get lacerations in the arms and the scalp as infantrymen tried to protect themselves. All this led to a lot of wounding and a lot of injury, and it was on a battlefield like this that there was this cataclysmic mismatch between the number of available surgeons and the number of wounded, which, as you'll see later, often ran into four figures. And the number of surgeons on the field, perhaps a handful of regimental surgeons, very difficult for them to cope. If we go and look in the background, actually, of the previous slide, around the edge of these battlefields, which are often in the American backwoods, were often farmhouses and meeting houses, really not much else at all. And so at a battle like Princeton, once the regimental surgeons perhaps given some first aid at the front and so on, the more seriously wounded would be moved back to these field hospitals. And this actually is the field hospital at Princeton. It's the Thomas Clark Farmhouse, very typical field hospital of the war. And Benjamin Rush operated on 4 British wounded soldiers here. All of them were amputated and all of them survived. And it sort of makes the point that there was good collaboration between the two army medical departments in a war that was marked by some terrible atrocities. This field hospital illustrates a slightly different point. This is the Birmingham Meeting House, which was the field hospital at the Battle of Brandywine, which was fought in September 1777 and was a massive British victory with a lot of American casualties. At the beginning of the fighting, this was the American field hospital, but due to the fluidity of battle, it eventually fell into British hands, and Benjamin Rush and his surgical colleague, who were the Americans originally operating there, had to run out of the field hospital back to their own lines under the cover of a white flag. This is a view of the Battle of Bunker Hill, fought in 1775. It was an exceptionally bloody battle, the first major battle of the American Revolutionary War. It makes some attempt to show in this depiction some of the management of the wounded, but I suppose in a way it's an image that's remarkable for what isn't there rather than what is, because one of the glaring omissions of medicine in the American Revolution, and indeed in the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars and the Crimea, was the absence of a proper ambulance service for British and at this time American troops. So much of the removal of wounded from the field was haphazard, as you see here, would rely on comrades to drag them off the field. Any collection would tend to be fortuitous, and many soldiers died of their wounds lying on the field overnight. Even when they got away from the field and maybe they were transferred over larger distances, say between field and general hospitals, there wasn't any committed proper ambulance or even committed wagons to carry them. They were reliant on the local carts of the country and the regimental wagons, which were usually actually intended for something else. So just to say a few words about hospitals, the regimental surgeons had their own regimental hospitals. There were these loosely defined things called flying hospitals, which tended to be formed around the rear of mobile armies. They were sort of semi-permanent, difficult to pin down because they often had a slightly different arrangement. These hospitals were, or the hospital illustrated here, these were the general hospitals, and these were necessary because after a major battle or a series of major battles, or after a major disease epidemic, of which there were many, what you needed was hundreds of hospital beds, not tens of beds as you might get in a regimental hospital, or slightly more in the flying hospital. And this, as it happens, is an American General Hospital. This is in the village of Bethlehem in Pennsylvania. And these hospitals, with rare exceptions, were not purpose-built. They were just opportunistically seized for use as general hospitals. They were subject to legislation and guidance and so on, but they were generally hotbeds of contagion. This hospital, which was designed for 500 men, it's actually a monastery, was holding 800 men at one time. And as you can imagine, in those sort of circumstances, poor ventilation, overcrowding, camp diseases like typhus and dysentery really took on. And Benjamin Rush felt that more than 80%, possibly 90% of American soldiers in the war who died of fever either contracted the fever or had worsening of their condition in a general hospital. Who actually looked after the patients? Well, there were medical staff. In the early years of the war, most of the hospital orderlies were disabled soldiers, convalescents. There were women acting as nurses, particularly on the American side in 1777. George Washington gave a directive that women should be employed in the hospital. So there were female hospitals, nurses in the Revolution, as there were in the Napoleonic Wars. It didn't all start with Florence Nightingale. Let's just mention a couple of innovations which were actually on the American side. This is a purpose-built American General Hospital at the Spa of Yellow Springs in Ohio, and this was the only purpose-built hospital of the war ordered by Congress. And it did seem to be an improvement. It was all relative, but the disease rates and the mortality rates in this hospital did seem to be less than in hospitals like Bethlehem. And the second innovation was introduced by a cranky American surgeon called James Tilton, who was very bright but unfortunately tended to antagonize others. He designed his small general hospitals. These were effectively sort of log cabins. The steps he took to avoid infection might seem commonsensical to us, but they were unusual to be, predetermined, pre-built in this form. So he arranged his cabins so that there was good ventilation of air and plenty of space for his patients. But these didn't take off, as didn't the larger purpose-built hospitals, largely due to apathy from the American Congress. And as I say, I think because Tilton rather irritated people with his idea. So I'm going to talk something about, talk around the surgery of the war, and particularly the battlefield surgery. I've rather backed off using American or British textbooks of the time. These do exist. There's particularly one by Jones, an American surgical textbook, and one by John Ramby, whose work on gunshot wounds is the sort of seminal surgical work used in the war. But these textbooks, they're sort of counsels of perfection. They probably don't represent what happened on the battlefield in many ways any more than a modern detailed medical textbook would illustrate, sort of an evening in A&E. They're quite detached from the stringencies of surgery in an era where there was no anaesthetic and no antisepsis and no blood transfusion. So the battle cat is Guildford Courthouse. This was a battle fought in 1781. So towards the end of the American Revolutionary War, and it was fought between Earl Cornwallis, who was the British senior general at that time, and Nathaniel Greene, who was the rebel leader. Just to orientate you in space, this is Guildford Courthouse. By this time, the fighting had moved down into the Carolinas. Guildford Courthouse is modern-day Greensboro. I'm not going to describe the battle. It was typical in many ways of many American Revolutionary War battles. There wasn't a lot of manoeuvring. To the south here, you've got Cornwallis's army with the regiments denoted, and up against him were the three lines of troops under the command of General Greene. What Greene did, he put his weaker militia in the first couple of lines, and then his veterans, the Continental Army, these were enlisted men in the third line. And to cut a long story short, Cornwallis really ploughed through these three lines and was ultimately a technical victor in the battle because he held the field at the immediate end of the action. But like a British officer said at the time, it was a sort of victory that ruined an army. It was very difficult for the British to replace their losses in the American War. That was one of their problems. It was much easier for the Americans to replace losses in battle. And the British lost a lot of men at Guildford Courthouse, despite being the sort of victors, inverted commas. So Cornwallis, as you can see from the numbers, had a relatively substantial army for this conflict of around 2,000 men. And for one reason or another, he lost about a quarter of them. And that was twice the American casualties. So it was a Pyrrhic victory, even more so as after the battle, Cornwallis didn't have the resources to remain on the field and retreated anyway. So at the end, Nathaniel Greene was in control of the battlefield, and therefore he was also in control of the care of the wounded. That's how it worked. It was the victor who tended to be left with the responsibility of the wounded on the field. So where did the wounded go? Well, this is a building close to the centre of action at Guildford Courthouse called a New Quaker. Many of the men wouldn't have got this far. It was estimated about 50 British troops died on the battlefield overnight because there was no formal collection. It was dark, it was raining. But the more fortunate ones, if you like, were either mobile, or they walked away from the field with Cornwallis's army, or the more seriously injured were triaged into this building, the New Quaker Meeting House. There were other buildings that contained most of the British and Hessian troops, the German troops, who were injured in the battle. And they were looked after by this man with a slightly odd name as Staff Surgeon West Hill. who it seems was a fairly typical staff surgeon in the British Army at this time. He came through the ranks, was a regimental mate and surgeon, and had become a staff surgeon just 3 years before the battle. His later advancement suggests that he was an intelligent man. We have no reason to believe he was anything other than a highly competent staff surgeon. And as you can see, he lived for a very prolonged period after this battle. Now, he was a prisoner of war because he was managing these men in this temporary facility on the battlefield, which was now in the hands of the rebels. And if you look into Cornwallis papers, you can actually find the pass that was given to West Hill to try and give him some protection. So this is written by an aide-de-camp of Cornwallis, and you won't be able to read it, I would guess, but it says, "It is hoped by his lordship, i.e. Cornwallis, that the surgeons," because Hill was accompanied by a hospital mate, "and wagons will not meet with any interference from the troops under the command of General Greene, or from the militia, or from the inhabitants." And he asks for the surgeon to be allowed to return after the battle. Also in the National Archives is this very unusual document, possibly unique, which is West Hill's surgical report of the battle, which, as you'll see, has deficiencies. It's not ideal, but it has the great plus, if you like, of being a real-time report written by a real surgeon in a real battle, not edited through several editions of a military surgical textbook. And he decided there were 64 men who were badly wounded enough to need hospitalisation, bearing in mind that this was now a couple of days after the battle and many men may already have died. So this was a pre-selected group. It excluded men who were too mildly wounded to need hospitalisation. I'm not going to take too long over the numbers, but just try to make one or 2 points. There were 83 wounds because about a quarter of the men, in fact precisely a quarter of the men, had multiple wounds. This may have been in part because the Americans were using buck and ball, where they put the musket ball and some smaller bits of shrapnel into the cartridge, and certainly at shorter distances it tended to multiply wound infantry soldiers. The term "the body" is strangely difficult to decipher. I think he means a very extensive wound of the torso. I haven't found anything to contradict that, and you can see other common sites with the limbs. But the point here is there are a very wide range of wounds in different parts of the body. He doesn't tell us all that much about what caused the wounds. He tells us about the site of the wounds and some of the actions that were taken and the outcome. We can probably assume that most of them were musket ball and buck and ball wounds, because we know that the Battle of Guildford Courthouse, that although there were cavalry and artillery on the battlefield, it was essentially, as is shown in this reenactment, it was essentially a firefight. So I think this got lost at the top slightly, but these are the 17 men who died out of the 64 men. And what's interesting about this, although of course the numbers are fairly small, is it does seem to mirror some of the wounds that we know were probably of poor prognosis, high risk at this time. So for instance, if you were wounded through the bowel, you were very likely to die of peritonitis. If you had an arterial wound, you were very likely to die of bleeding. And these wounds through the body were probably just very extensive, hence they weren't delineated as a chest or the abdomen and so on. So there seems to be overlap between this list and the causes of death that we know to be common, at least were suggested in more formal surgical texts of the period. So what about amputation? Because if you read accounts of surgery in the late 18th and early 19th century, particularly by soldiers, you might tend to believe that almost everybody who had an operation had an amputation. Excuse me, there are great stories of piles of arms and legs everywhere and so on. But there was a lot of controversy about amputation at the time of the American Revolutionary War. There probably still is, I would guess. But the exact indications, the exact timing, the exact technique were still matters of conjecture. Interestingly, in the 64 cases in the New Garden Meeting House, there are only 4 amputations. So it suggests, at least in this cohort of patients who were selected for severity of wounding, amputation was a relatively rare event. As you can see, all 3 leg amputations survived, and the 1 amputation of the arm didn't survive. So all the conclusions from this are tentative. The first 48 hours of the battle weren't in the report. It's only 1 surgeon. Limited case numbers, although it was 1/6 of the British wounded in the battle, so not inconsequential. And it was a pre-selected group of cases. And without over describing this, I think the sites of wounding were relatively predictable. Ball wounding was perhaps more common than one might think, 2 or 3 wounds. Mortality was around 27%. Actually, I think all the deaths were between 5 and 15 days after the start of the report, which suggests that men who survived the battle probably lived a few more days, but then perhaps, just conjectural, but perhaps they got infection or they had secondary hemorrhage and they died in that period. And there is this sort of loose connection with known poor prognostic factors: compound fractures, arterial injuries, wounds through the thigh, lungs and intestine. Thigh was a bad site to get wounded because it was difficult to amputate. And amputation, at least in this series, is infrequently performed. And that seems to be the case in some of the more informed surgical sort of eyewitness accounts of the wars. The same on the American side as well. They learned to be more conservative. So, moving away from surgery to disease, this is a representation of fever. It's quite a famous image, you might have seen it before. Fever has been sort of compared to cancer, in that fever was the sort of cancer of the 18th century. A rather simplistic comparison, but fever was the cause of 80% of deaths, and therefore it attracted a considerable amount of medical attention and experimentation and different treatment regimes and so on. So I think the parallel with 21st century cancer is not overly stretched. It is possible to identify modern disease entities in the soldiers of the American Revolution. I mean, sometimes it's easy. So sometimes the word typhus is used or the word dysentery is used. So a modern terminology. Sometimes it's a little bit more archaic, so they tend to talk about different types of fever. So, for instance, jail fever or hospital fever or putrid fever would probably be typhus, possibly typhoid. And in the American South, remittent fever or intermittent fever would probably be malaria. The causes of these diseases were completely mysterious because, of course, the science of microbiology and our knowledge of microorganisms and insect vectors and all this was well into the future. And there was a general view amongst most army doctors and in the civilian world that these diseases were mainly due to miasmata or miasma, these invisible poisonous gas clouds that emanated from latrines and swamp and vegetable matter in the ground, rotting horse carcasses, so on and so forth. And I think that was, you could understand why they thought that, particularly in the American southern states. There was a certain acceptance that contagion might be playing a role, but that was a theory more in its infancy. According to an army doctor of the mid-18th century, army life was in every way obnoxious, and that was the broad opinion as to why soldiers were always more likely to contract disease than civilians. And here is a simple list of common army diseases in the American Revolutionary War. This applies to both sides. Yellow fever isn't there, but although it was prevalent in North America around this sort of time, there were no epidemics during the American Revolutionary War years. Dysentery was the commonest cause of death in soldiers of the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Typhus, the history of human misery. Smallpox was much more of a danger to the American soldiers than the British. The American soldiers were mostly from the backwoods. They had very limited acquired immunity until Washington undertook his mass inoculation. They were exquisitely vulnerable to smallpox. Similarly, or on the other hand, if you like, British soldiers were more prone to malaria, particularly in the southern states, where American soldiers probably had more natural immunity, particularly the militia units who lived there. Typhoid is often difficult historically to tease out from typhus. Liver disorders included alcohol abuse, which was endemic, also acute hepatitis. Venereal diseases were always common in war. Scurvy affected soldiers as well as sailors. Mental disorders, again, always occurred in war, often called nostalgia in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and aches and pains were ubiquitous on campaign. More than 80% of deaths were due to disease. So disease was the great enemy of the soldier of the late 18th, early 19th century, not weapons. What were the sick rates? These are very broad averages. The American sick rate about 16%. 1 in 6 men could expect to be sick at any given time. The British and German troops slightly better. In the early years of the war, the discipline in the Continental Army was very poor, and probably the tenets of military hygiene, which I'll come on to, were not very well applied. Probably the more disciplined British and German troops probably obeyed the rules of cleanliness and so on a little bit better. The Americans were poorly accommodated compared with the British, often in ramshackle sort of camps. And of course, there was a smallpox factor as well. These are averages. If soldiers were in the wrong place at the wrong time, then it could change very quickly. When the British troops were around New York in 1779, they were suffering from malaria and dysentery, and then transports arrived from England full of troops with typhus, and that multi-disease epidemic of typhus, dysentery, malaria, you suddenly had very high mortality rates and sick rates well over 50%. So this was a continually fragile situation. What about treatment? Treatment is completely alien to us today. Bordering on crazy, really. But it was not too illogical if you believe the miasmatic theory of disease. So soldiers were bled enormous amounts. They were given purgatives, emetics, sudorifics to make them sweat. Cold water was thrown upon them. So these were all designed to get rid of those impurities in the blood. But of course, in reality, they just made things worse. The drugs that were available in rare instances were useful. Peruvian bark could be useful if used in sufficient amount in malaria. There are opiates, which might give succour to men with dysentery or pain, but many of the drugs, for instance, malaria, were also harmful. This just is a lancet. It was made in 1774, and this is the American maker. And we know this was used by a man called Justin Stores, who was assistant surgeon in the Connecticut Continental Line. It's one of the amazing exhibits they have at the Museum of the American Revolution. There's a sort of a disconnect, I suppose, in the to us entirely irrational attempts at treatment and the attempts at disease prevention that seem very contemporary today and entirely sensible in many ways. Military hygiene is about cleanliness, ventilation, space, good clothing, discipline, good food. And it was known from ancient times, the armies of Rome and so on, that if you applied these tenets of military hygiene, then disease rates started to fall. And these rules were rediscovered in the middle of the 18th century, notably by a man called John Pringle, a British physician who's generally regarded as the father of British medicine. And military hygiene was applied by both sides in the war as best they could. It was in general orders. It always relied on military officers to enforce it because, of course, doctors had very limited authority with the ordinary soldiers. Quarantine requires no explanation. It was used very extensively in the American Revolution, particularly in the context of protecting others from smallpox. Again, that's a subject to which I'll return. Inoculation was the precursor to vaccination. The difference was in inoculation, I know many of you will know this, but in inoculation you made a wound, you put some of the variola virus into the wound, and the person got a mild case of smallpox, which gave them lifelong immunity. And if it was done properly, under proper supervision, then the mortality rates from this mild case of smallpox were very low, perhaps 2%. It was often abused, but that's a slightly different story. And it's worth stressing again, what a big risk it was for Washington to inoculate his troops, because they were all developing this mild case of smallpox, taking them out of circulation. So it was a major gamble, but it played out in his favour. There was a lot to do about inoculation at the time. It's often the subject of caricature. But I think the narrative is often sort of flawed. I think there was a lot of feeling that there was rioting in the States because they were against inoculation. For instance, Cotton Mather, who was a preacher, the first man to introduce inoculation to Boston, had his house firebombed, and of riots in various other American cities. But actually, if you look into this, they were not really rioting against inoculation. The American citizens of these cities were rioting against the of it all, in that only the elite, only the wealthy could have this supervised, cautious inoculation. And of course, it put the poorer members of the community at risk. This next slide is a bit upsetting, to just give you prior warning. I'm showing you this just to remind you what a really horrible disease smallpox was. This is a photograph in 1901. This child was vaccinated in infancy and this child wasn't. So vaccination very effective, and indeed inoculation was as well. So one of the questions that always arises when you consider disease and war, did disease change the course of the war? Would America now be in control of Canada if it hadn't been for smallpox? Would America not be independent if it wasn't for malaria? And so on and so forth. The two campaigns that are generally seized upon to justify military and to hypothesize that disease was the major factor in outcome are the American invasion of Canada, which was at the outset of the war in 1775 and 1776. This was before Washington had inoculated his troops against smallpox. So at the risk of over-iterating this was a group of men who, were facing a catastrophe if smallpox got into their ranks. This shows the campaign in the north. Benedict Arnold, who was an American general who would defect to the British, approached, I think Quebec's just under the top of the slide, Quebec from the east, and Montgomery, who was previously fought for the British in the French-American War, lots of fluid loyalties, approached from the west. They failed to take Quebec, and smallpox broke out among the American troops. This just shows you the sort of conditions in which the Americans were fighting. The British were in their garrison and had received reinforcements and were in a much better position, not least more immune to smallpox. By the time the Americans got back to the American border, the southern Canadian border, they'd lost about 40% of their men, probably about 5,000 men, and nearly all of them died of smallpox. And the descriptions of it are the most horrific descriptions of the American Revolution. John Adams, who was later to become president of America, witnessed the troops return to Ticonderoga and Crown Point and wrote a famous letter to his wife, which you may not be able to read, but it says, "The smallpox is 10 times more terrible than British, Canadians and Indians together. This was the cause of our precipitate retreat from Quebec." And that was the American narrative. And there's also a committee drawn up to discuss the debacle who blamed the demise of the American army, the ruination of the American army, they said, on smallpox. But these things are often difficult to tease out. And this was a badly planned, under-resourced, incompetently commanded, medically under-resourced expedition that was always likely to fail. So it seems that disease increased the mortality, but whether disease was the seminal cause of the failure is much more difficult to say. And that's what tends to happen when you try and analyse the role of disease in war. It's very difficult to untangle military incompetence from disease as a factor in defeat. And the same was true of Cornwallis's campaign in the south. The British Army was hopelessly debilitated by malaria. It should have known that was going to be the case, as the south was notoriously swampy and unhealthy. At one time, all of Cornwallis's staff and himself were sick. So disease not only thinned the ranks, it debilitated the leadership. It served as a deterrent to local loyalists enrolling into the British Army. So disease could be attritional in many ways. This is just to orientate you where these campaigns were fought, mainly in the North and South Carolinas. We know that the disease was malaria. The descriptions are very explicit. There's a soldier called Robert Jackson, who was subsequently to be very well known, became a great medical author of the early 19th century. And in the American Revolutionary War, he was assistant surgeon to the 71st Foot, who were camped at this place, a place called Cheraw, on the PD River in South Carolina. And he describes malaria, a really unpleasant form of malaria, a remittent fever with gangrene that was much more like the malaria of the tropics than the malaria that was witnessed, say, in the Low Countries at this time in Europe. And as you can see, all these events have not been completely forgotten. There's currently a plaque in the churchyard. The church was used as a British regimental hospital. So it's a bit like Canada. The disease certainly debilitated the British. One army doctor, a man called Hayes, claimed it was the only reason for the rebel hold on the colonies. But that's a little far-fetched. Again, it was poorly planned, under-resourced, and you could argue that the disease had sort of been sent to torture an army that was already destined for some form of defeat. In the final part of the talk, I'm just going to talk briefly about disease in some specific groups of people. Civilians died in large numbers, undoubtedly. There were troops with typhus and dysentery marching through their villages. That was inevitable. There are reports of mass graves of civilians, American civilians who died of disease, but it's very difficult to enumerate the losses. This shows an illustration of American prisoners of war in the British prison hulk, HMS Jersey, which is often off New York. Many of the American prisoners who were captured were sent to prison hulks, particularly off Charleston in the south and New York in the north. Both the British and the Americans treated the prisoners in a completely appalling manner. The British probably worse than the Americans. You can imagine that these men shut up in these prison hulks with no medical provision were soon dying from smallpox and typhus. And every day the jailers would throw American bodies overboard. And according to the New Hampshire Gazette, 1,700 American prisoners of war died in 3 days during one period. There's a lot of propaganda around this war, so that may be an exaggeration. Not all soldiers were affected equally. I've already said that the American troops in general were more prone to smallpox, but the black troops were more prone to smallpox than the white European troops. It appears that they had less acquired immunity. They were often denied inoculation. The black troops in the American ranks, as illustrated here, had a higher mortality from disease than the white troops. Black troops were recruited into the British Army. There was one regiment raised by Lord Dunmore called the Ethiopian Regiment that was made up entirely of black slaves, and that was entirely decimated by smallpox. And one American source, again it may be exaggerated, but Thomas Jefferson suggested that out of 30,000 American slaves who joined the British in Virginia, 27,000 died of infectious disease. But they were not the worst affected group. The group of people in America during the years of the Revolution who were most affected by disease were the indigenous American people, the American Indians, who were hopelessly vulnerable, particularly to smallpox, because not only did they not have acquired immunity to the disease. Because this was an old world disease, they didn't have any innate immunity either. And they were, well, wiped out is rather a loose term, but they were certainly, their numbers were substantially reduced by epidemics of smallpox that had mortality rates in excess of 90%. This is an interesting drawing. It's on a piece of animal hide, and it's from a member of the Lakota tribe who lived in the area to the west of the Great Lakes, sort of the Dakotas, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, that sort of area. And what this American Indian historian has done is produced a graphic for each year of their history. And as you can see, during two of the early, well, actually the later years of the Revolution in 1780 and 1781, the main event was smallpox. So did the British exploit their lesser vulnerability to smallpox to weaponize the disease? I mean, Washington was in no doubt. He made the accusation as early as the siege of 75. And as he says here, our ungenerous enemy has, as usual, propagated the smallpox. So he hadn't changed his mind by the end of the war. As you might imagine, this has attracted some historical debate. There isn't overwhelming evidence that the British sort of, in a calculated fashion, introduced the smallpox into the American army. There is one document, a letter written by an officer around the siege of Yorktown to Cornwallis, saying that he'd brought 700 slaves, not the word he used, but 700 slaves down the river with smallpox, and he intended to spread them through the rebel plantations. So I think on occasion there was probably intent. Whether that was widespread, difficult to say. The losses of the war, very round figures indeed. Perhaps 25,000 American troops died. The asterisk note at the bottom just makes a comparison with the later American Civil War. And interestingly, the percentage of forces and the percentage of total population lost might have been quite similar in the two conflicts. The British forces lost around 10,000 men, again a round number, perhaps about a quarter of the men they sent across the Atlantic. And these are all even more approximated figures. What we can say with some certainty is at least 80% of these men died from disease, possibly more. Was there progress in the American Revolutionary War with respect to medicine? In army medicine, not much. There was a slow continuum of learning, I suppose. People got experience, but there was no Larrey's ambulance. There was no breakthrough in medical treatment and so on. Just better organisation and individual doctors becoming more skilled. If there was an improvement, it was perhaps counterintuitively more in a civilian medicine population, because the legislation, the organisation that had been invested in the American Army Medical Department spilled over into civil medicine in the years after the American Revolutionary War. According to one American historian, the American doctors of the Revolution played a more vital role than the doctors of any other war, which is quite a statement, but I sort of know what he means, because many of these doctors, some of them were loyalists, but most of them were patriots, and they played a military and political role, particularly a political role, in addition to their medical role. So 6 physicians signed the Declaration of Independence, and out of the first 7 commanders of the US Army, 3 were trained as physicians. So that's all so good, but surely this is all a long time ago and not very much to learn, different challenges, different times. But actually, when you read through the accounts of the American Revolutionary War, there are certain elements that I think have resonance today. Some of them are more obvious than others. A particularly obvious target are the correlates between smallpox prevention in America in the late 18th century and the management of COVID dissemination in the early 21st century. So if we look at the American attempts to prevent smallpox, enforcement of quarantine, they had the 6-foot rule. So if you had smallpox, they put a post 6 foot long outside with a red flag on the end. So there's sort of equivalence to social distancing. There was controversial closure of schools and public buildings, skepticism about inoculation, attempts to certify inoculation, and variable enforcement of inoculation, also controversial. It seems that Washington's mass inoculation of the American army was pretty well enforced, whereas in the British army it was much more a matter of choice. And I think that's the last slide, except for the last slightly modest slide, which is just a plug for the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Would you take some questions?
Yeah, of course, yeah, no problem.
Would anyone like to? Yes?
Martin, you mentioned many times typhus there. Can you remind us of how you catch typhus, how it spreads and how it kills you?
Yeah, I mean, the question is how does typhus spread and how does it kill people? Typhus is a rickettsial disease. It's carried by lice and so on, so it's often carried, in blankets and soldiers' clothing and so on, and it's particularly dangerous in cold conditions where troops are crowded together. So if you look at the instance of typhus in the American Revolution, it was probably, the epidemics were more in the middle and northern states. The diseases which we might regard more as tropical diseases were more common in the south. Very difficult to know how many people died of typhus. I think what often happened, is dysentery often comes out as a common cause of death, but I think what often happened is people were maybe disabled with diseases like typhus and typhoid, and then dysentery carried them off when they were already debilitated.
Any other question?
Thank you very much, Martin. Was a moment in when disease threatened to sort of change the balance, particularly the winter that Washington spent around Valley Forge? There must have been quite a risk of disease.
Yeah, I think there was, and I think the question is, was there a moment in the war where disease could have tilted the balance, particularly in Valley Forge, which was the American winter camp? The conditions in Valley Forge are sort of part of American folklore, aren't they? They all want to talk about Valley Forge because the American army was at this incredibly low ebb, and the way that Washington took the decisions he did. I think there must have been times at Valley Forge where the Americans were in danger of destruction. I think when you look at disease and the war, though, there's always an element of a short-termism about its impact. The fact is, at the end of the day, while the Americans continued fighting, the British were having to send more and more troops across the Atlantic. Many of them died in transit. They arrived unwell. So I think disease didn't tip the war in the end. I think the British just ran out of willpower and men. So disease was a sort of a slightly sort of ancillary factor, even at Valley Forge.
Yes, Jonathan.
Just in terms of wounds that people got in battle, you hear a lot about obviously gangrene and bacterial infections. I just wonder, does tetanus ever get a mention?
Yeah, the question was does tetanus ever get a mention in wounds? It does. It's probably, I would say, it's more mentioned. It does get mentions in the American Revolutionary literature, probably more in the Napoleonic Wars. But no, tetanus was well understood and was generally thought to be universally fatal. There were various treatments tried, all sorts of antiphlogistic measures. Larrey, who was the great surgeon, not of this war, but of the subsequent Napoleonic Wars, recommended cautery in tetany. There are anecdotal cases of men with tetanus surviving, but one assumes they probably didn't have tetanus.
Yes.
Thank you, Martin, for a rich and comprehensive talk there. I wanted to, obviously, from a psychiatric point of view, you mentioned, I think you said the word nostalgia there.
Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about anything to do with any mental health aspects of what's called like PTSD or whatever, or desertion, psychosis? Anything like that came up in your research?
Yeah, I think it does. It probably, again, more for the Napoleonic Wars than the American Revolutionary Wars. I think there are mentions of it. I mean, you certainly see references to things that you could identify as depression, equivalents to shell shock, PTSD. You do see these in soldiers' anecdotal accounts. I think the full development of nostalgia came more in the Napoleonic period, but the term is used in the late 18th century. What it was originally used for was to describe the sort of melancholy and depression that seemed to afflict soldiers that were sent far from their home villages. Because many of the troops, both in the American Revolutionary War and the Napoleonic Wars, were just from small villages. You know, they never left the village, so they enrolled in these armies. Particularly true of the American, who were from the backwoods mostly. And many of them became melancholic and depressed and wanted to return. And of course, they were only enlisted, many of them, for a short period. So this sort of mental state was an issue for men like Washington and so on. And I think nostalgia was in a continuum of mental disorders in soldiers of the period that you're right, and then now has attracted, I mean, I'm not any sort of expert on recent disorders of the mind in soldiers, but in more recent times might be required called first shell shock, and then more recently, as you say, PTSD and other similar disorders.
Martin, thanks for a great talk.
Oh, thanks, Abby. Thank you.
You've described how illness at the time might have been ancillary, and that really the British ran out of logistics of providing men. What was the learning from these wars, or did it come to you to provide the analysis and learning? You know, what happened? Why didn't the British, for example, learn to inoculate afterwards?
Well, I suppose the British probably felt the smallpox was their friend more than their enemy in the American Revolutionary War, and it certainly had more impact on the American side. Sorry, the question was about
Analysis.
What did the British learn from the war, possibly militarily, partly medically? I think the first part of the question seemed a bit more military. I think one of the major reasons they lost the war, in truth, was manpower. And you have to think that this was a civil war. There were Tories, who supported the British Crown, including doctors, and there were and then there were the rebels, the patriots, and so on. And in the end, the British made a fundamental miscalculation. They thought they were going to enroll a lot of loyalists, so they're going to pick up a lot of men on the ground in America, and that never happened. They didn't enroll in the numbers. So the reason they lost the war in that sense, I think eventually they could see there was no way they were going to win it. The Americans were just going to keep replacing and so on. As for inoculation, I think, one of the remarkable things about military medicine is how little was learned between wars. Yes. So if you go back to the American War of 1812, which was the next American conflict after the American Revolution, really all the same problems, hospitals overcrowded, no ambulance and so on. You go into the Napoleonic Wars, no ambulances, hospital overcrowded. You go into the Crimea and it's still the same. So I think people don't tend to learn lessons from war because they forget them in peace, don't they?
Right, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to stop any questions at the moment, and I'm going to ask Jim Drive if you would care to give a vote of thanks.
Well, it's very likely that anybody's going to vote against for such a wonderful talk. It really is a privilege to have heard it, and I have had the unenviable task of being tasked with taking minutes. So I think the answer is buy the book. And,
that would be good. That would be good.
But I doodling you beforehand 5 books.
8 now.
Eight books. I've lost count. And it's just an absolutely masterly thing to give us at the same time in such a tight schedule the big picture. We've now, many of us, got a much clearer understanding of why we lost, and at the same time, so much detail selected to give us a really vivid picture of how things were. It's a remarkable performance, if I may say that.
Thank you.
It's been
you.
a privilege to watch. I think that my neighbour here sums it up by saying we've heard a stonking talk, and I really would like to ask everyone to thank him.